Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Madhavi Gayatri Raman from the English and Foreign Languages University, and we are going to look at Module 20, Developmental Disorders of Language, from the Introduction to Linguistics paper. What do Tom Cruise, Leonardo da Vinci, Tommy Hilfiger, Agatha Christie and Pablo Picasso have in common? I'm sure you would say they're all people with extraordinary capabilities, but there is something else too. Did you know they are dyslexic? What does that mean? The term dyslexia comes from the Greek word dys, meaning impaired, and lexis, meaning word. It refers to an impairment in the ability to read, and this is not due to a lack of intelligence or a lack of educational opportunity. Dyslexia is a language disorder that has been discovered and discussed for well over a century. In this unit, we describe dyslexia and provide some of its current definitions. We look at signs that suggest a child might be dyslexic and is in need of remedial help. We also look at specific language impairment or SLI, a more recent language disorder in which a child shows a broad delay in oral language. We look at the relationship between SLI and dyslexia and the problems of identifying dyslexia in a second language situation. But before we look at a reading disorder, let's look at what it means to learn to read in an alphabetic language. English, as we all know, is an alphabetic language, and learning to read in such a language is a complex skill. For example, take the letters H and A. Both of these share similarities in that they have vertical lines and a crossbar, and readers should be able to see the critical differences between these two. They should be able to understand and recognize individual letters, the relationship between letters and their sounds, and this ability to be able to see the correspondence between a letter and its sound is known as decoding. When children come to school, more often than not, they bring with them a knowledge of the language that is spoken at home, the L1, and they are aware of various aspects of this language, its syntax, its phonology, its semantics, and they bring this with them when they learn to read. Therefore, learning to read in a first language is much easier because they already know the sounds in that language, the meaning in that language, and now what they have to do is put together the sounds along with the print. Decoding is therefore a skill that is sometimes picked up either in the home when children are read aloud to, or later once they come into school when formal instruction begins. However, it is different with the case of learning to read in a second language. Very often children come into school with little or no exposure to a second language, which in our context is English. So we would have different kinds of populations of children with little exposure to English and a lot of exposure to English. Now, when they come into school, what they need to do is to be able to learn to read and write in a language which they have probably never heard before, and this creates a number of problems for them, and therefore their reading difficulties are complicated. Some children may face difficulties in learning to read not just English, but even the first language which they have already heard and been exposed to at home. And this difficulty with learning to read despite adequate exposure to the language is what we call dyslexia. So let's look at some definitions of dyslexia now. The World Federation of Neurology, 1968, defines dyslexia as a language disorder in children who, despite conventional classroom experience, fail to attain the skills of reading, writing and spelling commensurate with their intellectual abilities. A more important definition, offered by MacDonald Critchley in 78, describes it as a learning disability which initially shows itself by difficulty in learning to read and later by erratic spelling and by a lack of facility in manipulating written as opposed to spoken words. The condition is cognitive in essence and is usually genetically determined. It is not due to intellectual inadequacy or lack of sociocultural opportunities or to faults in the teaching techniques or to any known structural brain defect. So as you can see, dyslexia is not due to a dysfunction in the auditory or visual systems. It is not a disability that is of constitutional origin. It is not due to a lack of exposure to language, and it is not due to lack of motivation. It is a disorder that affects the acquisition of literacy skills. As we said, it affects reading, spelling, and writing. It impairs the development of reading and spelling accuracy. It reduces a child's comprehension ability, thereby limiting his vocabulary and hinders communication. What are some of the possible signs that we could look out for in a child that indicate that he or she might be dyslexic? When a child who could be at risk for dyslexia reads, it is common to find the child breaking it down into its component letters. And therefore, if you have a word like cat, the child would go C, A, T, and try to string it together and say cat, even though the child has seen this word a number of times in print and has been taught to read it in class. They could have difficulty in holding verbal information in short-term memory. Children with dyslexia could have difficulty in learning sequence of things like the months of the year or the days of the week. They have difficulty in recognizing and producing rhymes. They would have difficulty in recognizing that words like sea, sand, and sound all begin with the same sound, sir. They would have difficulty in naming objects, colors, or numbers quickly and accurately, and difficulty in pronouncing long words like elephant or perpendicular. Now, these difficulties are also seen in normal children who would often say effluent instead of elephant. So does that mean every child who makes these errors is dyslexic? The answer is no. If a child is making errors and is showing the list that we just mentioned as showing at least 2, 3, or maybe even more, a cluster of errors, then the child might be at risk for dyslexia. And each child shows a different cluster of errors. This means that every dyslexic is different from another. So the point to remember is that one symptom does not constitute dyslexia, and children need to show a cluster of symptoms. That's the first. The second is each child exhibits a different set of symptoms, making remediation, making identification difficult. A third problem is that poor reading ability often exists side by side with good understanding and good problem solving skills during oral discussions. So teachers often find in their classrooms that these children are good at oral work, are good at discussions in class, are good at math and skills like music, but are poor when it comes to writing and reading. And often this is one reason why such children easily get the label of being distracted, lazy, inattentive in class. But the reason for their distraction or inattentiveness is the fact that they cannot or are struggling with reading and writing and spelling because of the language disorder that they have. What is the prevalence rate of dyslexia in the classroom? Does it really exist? Is it a large percentage? Well, almost 7 to 10% of children in a classroom suffer from dyslexia, which means in a class of 30, you could have at least 3 children who might be dyslexic. This prompted researchers to ask the question, if children had a problem with reading and writing that they were exhibiting in the classroom, did they have problems with spoken language when they were younger? Since oral language skills are the precursor to literacy skills. And the answer is yes. Research has shown that children with dyslexia are often children who have had problems with oral language. And this problem with oral language, as we know it today, is called specific language impairment. And it came to be noticed when children began to show a broad delay in oral language acquisition for no apparent reason. So, what is the relationship between dyslexia and SLI? There are similarities between dyslexia and SLI in both directions, in that children with dyslexia have had problems with oral language acquisition, and children with oral language problems go on to exhibit difficulties with reading and writing once they come into school. A number of studies that have looked back at young children and have also followed young children into school years have shown that those who had problems with oral language were the ones who showed up with dyslexia once they started acquiring the skills of reading and writing. The prevalence rate for dyslexia, not surprisingly, is at 7%, almost as it is for dyslexia. And approximately 85% of the children with SLI have dyslexia and vice versa. Children with dyslexia have also known to perform below the mean on a battery of oral language tasks used to diagnose SLI. Very often, normal children also are late talkers. So, does that mean that they are at risk for SLI as well? This is not the case, and we need to exercise a little caution here. If the oral language problems of a child resolve by the time he is 5, these children will perform well as adolescents in some aspects of language, such as comprehension, but they may still have problems in other aspects. However, if their problems continue after they are 5, then they are likely to show problems in both oral and written language, and these will continue into adolescence and adulthood. Therefore, dyslexia and SLI, which were at one time studied as different and distinct disorders by two different professional groups, are today studied as two facets of a common developmental disorder. SLI and dyslexia are now seen as 2 points on a continuum rather than as two distinct disorders. We now look at what some of the indicators of SLI might be, and we begin with delayed language milestones. So, how do we know that a child has oral language problems? First, the parent could report that the child is a late talker. That is, he or she says his first words after 18 months of age, which is well beyond the time for a child to begin his or her first words. The child has a vocabulary of less than 50 expressive words, and the child is not at the 2-word stage even at 2 years of age. When it comes to talking, even though the child's speech sounds may be clear, the explanations that a child offers may be difficult to understand. The child may have problems with vocabulary, that is, he may use the wrong words, may have difficulty learning new words, and often has word finding problems. There will also be errors with grammar, such as word order or tense. The child may tend to use simplified sentences, simple grammatical structures, leave out critical parts of sentences, or even use unusual or unacceptable word order. Children with SLI may also show difficulty in retrieving words from memory. What about comprehension? When it comes to understanding, these children show difficulties understanding teachers' instructions. They have difficulties remembering the meaning of words or can get the wrong meaning. and they also have difficulties understanding abstract concepts such as time, size, and quantity. We now look at the next aspect, which is the problem of identifying dyslexia in a second language situation. As we have said earlier, in a second language situation, children come to school with a variety of first languages, and these are the languages that they know to speak, and they are only learning the process of making sound symbol correspondences between the sounds and print, and therefore learning to read is a skill that they are able to master much more quickly in their home languages. In English, however, like we said, it is a different scenario. Children come with little exposure to a lot of exposure, and sometimes some children are fluent speakers of English when they come into school, and therefore the situation in the classroom is very different. Children are now learning to acquire all four skills in a language that they may not be familiar with, that is, in English. So, in English, they are learning to read and write while at the same time they are learning the language as well. And this becomes problematic simply because the acquisition of reading depends on prior knowledge of the language. And in their case, they have no prior knowledge of the language, and very often there isn't an input rich environment in the classroom. So, what does the child do when he's trying to learn to read? Obviously, he is struggling, and this struggle can often lead to the danger of the child being termed dyslexic, because we are looking at his difficulty in English and we find that he is struggling to read in English. But we don't look at how he or she is learning to read in the L1, because there the child is perhaps finding it much easier. So, one thing that we need to keep in mind when we are looking at dyslexia is how is the child reading in the L1, and we will come to this a little later. In an ESL context, it is therefore difficult to differentiate between children who are learning the second language normally and children who are struggling because they have a disorder for a major reason, which is that both these groups, normally developing children learning a second language and children with SLI, show similar patterns of difficulty. That is, they have difficulties with grammar, they have difficulties with syntax, they have difficulties marking tense, and therefore this leads to cases of missed identity and mistaken identity. What do we mean by these two terms? Missed identity is a question of leaving a child alone and not paying attention to him or identifying him as probably language disordered, because we are saying that this is a child who will catch up if he gets sufficient exposure to the language. Mistaken identity is when we say, oh, this child is making errors, he is probably dyslexic, when actually all he needs is further exposure to the language. So, as you can see, the situation is rather tricky. Therefore, before labeling a child as SLI or dyslexic, it is very important to determine whether the child's errors are due to incomplete acquisition of English or due to language impairment. And this is not an easy task, given that there are so many factors involved. There is individual difference in the time taken to master a language. There is the amount of exposure that the child has to a language. There is the question of the input rich environment. All of these have to be taken into account. The other essential factor that we need to bear in mind before we label a child dyslexic is to test the child in his or her L1 with tools and tests that have been developed for that particular language. For example, if the child is a Hindi-English bilingual, then the child must be tested in Hindi and in English before we can come to a reliable conclusion that this child is dyslexic. And the child has to show difficulties across both Hindi and English. If we find that the child has problems only in English and not in Hindi, then the child is not dyslexic. This child is showing difficulties in acquiring the skills of reading and writing in English only because he or she hasn't had enough exposure to English. But if a child shows difficulties with both Hindi and English, then we can say that this is across languages, and this is because there is definitely a language impairment. Finally, we need to collect information about the child's language milestones through parental reports and language profile questionnaires. To sum up, in this module, we have looked at two developmental language disorders, specific language impairment and dyslexia. We have looked at the relationship between these two disorders, the signs that indicate a child might have dyslexia, the indicators of a child having specific language impairment, and the problem of being able to identify children for dyslexia and SLI in a second language situation. If you'd like to know more about SLI or dyslexia, do take a look at the references provided at the end of the presentation. I'm sure that should give you a few more leads. Thank you and good luck.